So the strategic planning process identified 3 key priorities for CAC over the next couple of years: employment, mental health, and aging offenders. So today's call is all about offender employment. For the other 2 priorities, we will also be holding a session like this one where we provide an overview of what research tells us about that priority topic, as well as a discussion about what is currently happening within Correctional Service Canada related to policy and programming. Follow-up action planning about what CAC members can do and how we can contribute to these priority areas will be occurring back in each of our regions. So today, as I said, we're focusing on offender employment. We have 2 special guests. Apparently you had to be named Lynn today in order to be a guest speaker, because we have Lynn Stewart, the Senior Research Manager, Interventions and Women Offenders from the Research Branch of CFC. We also have Lynn Garrow, the CEO of CORCAN. So with that, we're going to start with the research overview. Then we'll have time for some questions. Then we'll turn it over to the other Lynn, and we'll have an update on CORCAN, also with an opportunity for questions. As you did hear, we are going to be recording this call, so any of our CAC members who weren't available at this particular time can still benefit from our conversation. So we will mute all the lines while each of our presenters is speaking. Then we'll open them up for questions. After today's session, we'll also be providing some links to the research reports that are available related to employment. We'll also circulate any other materials that might be helpful to us in our action planning. So with that, thanks again for being on the call, and I'll turn it over to Lynn Stewart from the Research Branch to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. As you mentioned, my name is Lynn Stewart, and our focus in my unit is on interventions, and that includes employment and women offender-specific research. So I just wanted to say before starting that this is a great initiative. It's really rewarding for me and for our unit and for the branch in general to know that you're interested in evidence-based research, and I think that aligns really well with the government support for evidence-based practice. And, of course, we always love the opportunity to discuss our research, and glad to think that it might have an actual application to correctional practice. So, as Laurie has mentioned, this is a brief presentation. I'm going to review in just a very general way the research we've conducted on correctional employment over the last few years. It's going to be a high-level overview, and the summary of all of these research projects that have been conducted recently and historically was prepared some time ago, and it was sent to your executive, I understand, to your regional chairs. And I do believe that is what Laurie was referring to when she said that these can be available to you. All of this research has already been published. It's on the web, or the one-page summaries are on the web, and you can request the full reports that are associated with the one-page summaries. But the document that we prepared for you has everything together, all the reports and all of the one-page summaries. If you have any questions about anything that I'm going to present when I'm finished, I'll be very happy to try to respond to those. First of all, I just want to start, I guess, with what would be also my ending. I'm going to start with the overall message, the takeaway message from this body of research. And this is what we have found, and it's consistent. We find this most recently and also historically. Offender problems with employment is an issue for over at least half of the men in CSC and over 60% of the women. And it's particularly acute as a problem for Aboriginal men and women, where the need level, and when I say need level, I mean a need level that's associated with their criminal history, it's over 70%. For men and women, employment and problems associated with unstable employment or lack of employment history is a key risk factor. It predicts returns to custody for any reason, and it also predicts returns to custody with an offense for men and for women. On the other hand, if offenders are employed in the community, at least shortly after release, there's a much better likelihood of success in the community for both men and women. We've just studied this in the last couple of weeks, and we found that for those for whom employment is a high need, they are 3 to 5 times more likely to return to custody on release, rated a high need. In follow-up, 16% of men with an asset in employment. That means that they have a very good employment history. They return to custody. As I mentioned, 16% of them will return to custody in 6 months, but almost 60% of those with a poor history will return to custody within 6 months. And for women, it's 9% of those with a good employment history who return to custody in 6 months, but 45% of those who have a high need in employment. So you can see that it's an important risk factor that should be addressed to reduce returns to custody, and in many cases, the research is also showing that it's associated with criminal recidivism. I want to highlight, though, for those of you, I guess all of you are in the community, that this doesn't, in my mind, mean that employment should be emphasized at the cost of not encouraging the offenders to attend the correctional programming in the community that they need to attend. Many of the problems that are associated with unstable employment, like poor impulse control, poor planning, poor goal setting, failure to consider consequences, these are addressed in programs, the focus of correctional programs, and the offenders who take those programs could improve their overall function in the community if they learn these skills. In the end, they probably will also, it would also contribute to them improving their employment, their success in employment. So I just want to go over a few of the main conclusions of some of the research that we've conducted. I'm going to start with a look at temporary absences and the role they play in reintegration. We have completed 2 or 3 studies in this area in the last little while. A recent study of women offenders in CSC found that overall, over 40% of women received a temporary absence during their sentence. I'm assuming that everybody knows what a temporary absence means. Participation in a TA, temporary absence, reduced unemployment and it reduced returns to custody. From the research, we concluded that the TAs play a valuable role in gradual reintegration to the community. And generally, what the finding is that the more they participate in TAs, the greater the benefits. More is better. Just moving on to a more specific piece of research that is on work releases. 3% of offenders participated in a work release in the study that was recently conducted. Offenders participating in any kind of release, including work release, were significantly more likely to receive discretionary release by the parole board. They had significantly lower levels of unemployment in the community. They returned to custody for any reason in a lower rate, and they returned to custody with a new offense at a lower rate. Work releases also had a very positive effect on Aboriginal offenders. Overall, 81% of Aboriginal offenders who had a work release found employment in the community within 2 years, and this is compared to 47% of Aboriginal offenders who didn't have a work release. I just wanted to point out for those of you who are very interested in research that this finding takes into consideration other risk factors. So it compares apples to apples, if you will, offenders with the same sort of risk level to offenders who have, so that we can say that it is probably employment, the fact that they've had a work release that distinguishes their outcomes. All the other factors are held constant. So finally, participating in a work release significantly reduced the odds of unemployment by about 64%. The more work releases, the greater the benefits in terms of post-release employment. Moving on now to looking at the research on kind of training and vocational certification that's done while the offenders are incarcerated and to what extent that assists the offenders. Training while incarcerated in the trades area results in a high level of congruence with finding work in that area in the community. So those who have a certification in a trade are more likely to get a job in the trades on release. Other forms of certification we find much lower levels of concordance. So from this research we can conclude that a focus on trade certification appears to help offenders find work in the community, in the area that they trained on, at least for male offenders. It's not as clear for women because their community employment is much more likely to be in sales and service. moving on to talk about a research project we conducted a couple of years ago that followed offenders who were released and related their work experience on release to their outcomes while they were in the community. I think this is an important a piece of research. It really does give us some direction on the role of employment. We found that offenders who were not employed with a stable job were more likely to return to custody than offenders who were employed with a stable job. Not surprising, but it was a very strong effect. After controlling for all the other risk factors that were related to recidivism, offenders who were not employed with a stable job were 3.6 times more likely to return to custody for any reason and 2.5 times more likely to return to custody with a new offense than offenders who were employed with a stable job. And it didn't matter what the skill level was of the job. The skill level was not significantly related to conditional release outcomes. So the key then is finding employment of any kind. It doesn't have to be skilled. Looking at who had the poorest employment history, it's probably not surprising these factors are associated with an unstable employment history and a lack of success in employment in the community. Aboriginal offenders who were higher risk, who had lower motivation, who had problems with substance use and the community function, that is, they had unstable accommodation and not much support in the community, were less likely to find stable employment in the community. Next piece of research is on institutional employment outcome studies. A research project followed offenders employed with CORCAN and compared their outcomes to offenders involved in other employment activities. Those in CORCAN were more likely than offenders employed in non-CORCAN institutional employment and offenders not institutionally employed at all to obtain a job in the community on release. So CORCAN seemed to promote employment in the community. However, CORCAN participation was not directly related to reductions in returns to custody. There was no overall association between CORCAN participation and direct reductions in recidivism, but they were more likely to be employed in the community, and those who were employed were more likely to have better outcomes. So there's a path towards better outcomes for those with CORCAN, but it's not a direct one. Taking a look at a couple of research projects that looked at offenders' attitudes towards employment and the extent to which they emphasize certain benefits of employment. So this research directly asked offenders what employment meant to them. It was a small study, a small sample of offenders for whom employment was a contributing factor in their offense history. These men and women stated that aspects of work that they found helpful was that it helped with their reintegration. They valued the relationship with coworkers. They valued the sense of belonging and the sense of achievement they associated with working. So it was not, for them, it wasn't just getting the pay. It was all of these intrinsic benefits as well. And another study that was done, a larger scale study, on employment opportunities while incarcerated, the offenders expressed a strong desire for skill-based trades training and accreditation, and they wanted more opportunities for meaningful work while they were in the institution. The reasons, the benefits they found or anticipated from employment were financial security, material gain. These were the most important, but they also mentioned benefits such as self-development, personal satisfaction, wanting to provide for family and friends. So this suggests, again, that the value assigned to employment is not just extrinsic, it's intrinsic as well. Okay, so back to the take-home messages. The research supports institutional employment and vocational trades training and certification in particular. Participation in institutional employment programs improves likelihood for community employment on release. For men, the most common employment was in the trades area. For women, they're more likely to find employment in sales and service. Institutional employment programs improve the chances of obtaining employment in the community for Aboriginal offenders as well. So this result is found for men, for women, and for Aboriginal offenders. Number 2, employment instability is a strong risk factor for men and for women. And I was just saying before the call that we've just completed another research project on all of the domains that we assess the offenders on. Employment and education is one of them, and we continue to find this as a strong risk factor. and may be particularly strong for women. It predicts reoffending. Therefore, from a case management, risk management point of view, anything that can be done to improve employment, promote stable employment, will improve community safety. Number 3, gaining employment in the early days after release improves women and men and outcomes for women and men, even when we control for other risk factors. So the bottom line to case management is that assisting offenders in finding stable employment and encouraging offenders by providing social support for employment and for their intention to find work shows that this, and the research, in fact, shows that this kind of social support for employment improves employment outcomes. So those are the take-home messages. I'm ready now to answer any questions that you might have on the research. Any points of clarification?
Yep. This is Diane Anthony in the Ontario region. Did you do any studies with the ethnocultural offenders at all?
The problem with that kind of research is that very often the numbers get quite low, and so we can't find the same sort of patterns. But I do believe we did do some research on ethnocultural. We did a one-page summary on that, and I don't have access to it right now. I'll look for it for you. Can you give me your name again?
It's Diane Anthony.
Diane.
We'll arrange to send out any links that you discover. We'll send it out to the entire
I'll
group.
See if I can find
relevance across. That would be great.
I think it was just a smaller study breaking down the different categories. We always break down by Aboriginal offenders because we have large enough numbers. Sometimes we can't break down the research by ethnocultural.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or questions or even some observations, something that struck you or stood out for you, or some experience you want to share about CAC connections with offender employment?
Oh, this is Moffat from Thunder Bay.
Go ahead, Moffat.
Yeah, just curious, has anything been done with offenders in healing lodges as regards to their... Because I think you were mentioning Kokan, and I know some healing lodges seem to have some kind of career or profession-oriented programs. What's the success rate?
I'm not aware of them. Of breaking down research by healing lodges. We break down the research by Aboriginal offenders, some of whom would have gone to the healing lodges, but there's no specific research on employment in the healing lodges. There is research on the healing lodges, and having said that, the research does touch on what programs are available for offenders who are in the healing lodges, and some of those include community outreach for employment for the offenders there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Andy Marsland from Winnipeg Parole here. I just wanted to back up your comment that you made that non-trade certificates aren't necessarily recognized in the community. We did a little bit of investigation into what are some of the barriers to employment, and that did come out with individuals that we had spoken with. So, so just backing up that, the non-trade certificates are not recognized in the community, so that might be something to
And that may explain why there's not a concordance with them finding work in those certificate areas, or a much lower concordance,
Yep.
Thanks, Mandy. As you say, identification of barriers helps us identify where CAC might be able to make some inroads. So that's an important recognition. Any other comments from the group?
Yeah, this is Hafiz Rahman from CSC at Collins Bay, Kingston. I was curious about the Aboriginal participation in the core camp. Did you do any studies on that?
Yes, all of the studies were broken down by Aboriginal offenders. What did you want to know about Aboriginal participation in CORCAN?
Or are they getting enough time in the CORCAN compared to the others?
I don't have that at my fingertips on what the relative percentage of Aboriginal participation in CORCAN is. I mean, that's something that we could perhaps look at in the report. The report breaks down who was involved in the study, who had gone to CORCAN, who had gone to employment that was not CORCAN directed, but within CSC, and those who were not employed. And it's broken down by Aboriginal offenders, so we could look at that table and see to what extent it affected, it included Aboriginal offenders. Lynn, do you have any research on whether Aboriginal offenders are proportionately as likely to be involved with CORCAN?
I don't right at my fingertips, but we can certainly give a breakdown. I mean, obviously in a lot of my shops in the prairies, I mean, the preponderance of the offenders in my shop are Aboriginal. And that's just by virtue of the pool that we're drawing from. But what I was actually going to ask you a question, Lynn, was it sort of picks up on the question that was just asked to you is when you look at how much time an offender should spend training with CORCAN in one of our shops. We've said for the last little bit we would like them for at least 90 days, 3 months. Do you have anything more on that, on the effectiveness, like the length of time required before we see some kind of an impact?
For the research, we set that as a limit because I think we had been told that was the period of time that you wanted to have people involved. So the offenders who didn't have an opportunity to be involved for about that time were not included in that research.
Okay, so they all did at least 90.
They all had some period of time in CORCAN, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Sharon at Edmonton CAC, EFW. I just wanted to find out if any study was done on the level of education that persons had who were going out to the community, and if that correlated with the...
Yeah, that's a good question. The domain on employment includes education. So we've recently done research on that. There are high rates of offenders who have less than a grade 12 and less than a grade 10. And we find that also is related to their outcomes. Those who with less education do more poorly. Mind you, it may also be because the lower education is related to other problems that might be associated with reoffending, like poor impulse control or with attending or completing and their goals. But yes, education is important, and it's a key factor in promoting reintegration.
Okay, thanks.
Any additional comments or questions for Lynn Stewart about the research aspect? Great. Well, with that, I'll be...
Sorry, it's Sherry from the Atlantic region. I'm just going to piggyback on what Diane Anthony had posed a question about the ethnocultural numbers, specifically because we deal with an ethnocultural portfolio. It would be great to know, on the same vein as the gentleman who posed the question of how, what are the numbers of the Aboriginal numbers accessing CORCAN. It would be great to know the same complement for the ethnocultural offender.
Great.
Sure, yeah, I don't know if we have that kind of a breakdown, but
just a comment.
Yeah. We can give you the breakdown.
Okay, and I think.
Yeah.
Although our call today is primarily for CAC, we will definitely share that information with our advisory committees because we're all in this together in terms of addressing employment as a priority area. So thank you in advance for whatever additional information we can pull together. That would be great. So with that, I think we'll take a pause now and we'll just turn it over to Lynn Garrow. It's a natural segue to talk more about CORCAN and talk about the types of programming that are available and again, perhaps some inroads for CAC and other advisory committees to think about. So, Lynn Garrow, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think what I'll do is I'll just start going back in time 3 years ago. 3 years ago, December 2013, is when I assumed the CEO leadership role in CORCAN. What had happened in October of that same year was incentive pay had been eliminated as a draft measure, and CORCAN was not doing well financially. They had a structural deficit of about $3 million on any given year, and for a special operating agency, that's just simply not allowed. So what happened was when I came in 3 years ago, I came in with the mandate given to me that I was to address the financial issues. And then, of course, I have a very strong mandate in terms of public safety, and that is, of course, to contribute to public safety through offering employment and employability skills training to offenders. So what I did, first of all, is I conducted 2 big reviews. One I did was a viability review of each of our 110 shops. And viability, I have to say, meant breaking even. So it was just that your costs were covered, so this was not about making $1 million a year. Out of that 110 shops, the agreement that I had with the commissioner of CSC was that if there was any shops that I was going to recommend closure to, that I would bring it to the ExCom table and we would have a conversation about whether it was so correctionally important to the service that they would assume the deficit and that shop or that site would remain open. I was really pleased to say that out of everything, we only closed one site in its entirety, and that, unfortunately, was Edmonton Max. And the reasons for that were that they were losing about $450,000 to $500,000 a year. They were subject to the most lockdowns of any of our sites, and the competing incompatible populations were running so high that the pool of inmates that we could choose from was very tiny. So unfortunately, that is a site that we closed, although I'm proud to say that we still remain at 3 other maximum security sites across the country. The second review that I did was a review of governance. We had mimicked CSC's model in that we had 5 regional headquarters across the country in the same locations as CSC. And what that had done was it had created a lot of negative incentives for people to keep work within a particular region because they were judged on their performance according to how their region did, not how Corcan did as a whole. So we have moved to regional business lines and, regional, centralized business lines. And so we have 4 business lines that we offer. We have manufacturing, which is our largest. Then we have construction, and then we have textiles and services. We implemented all of that restructuring exactly 1 year ago this month. What that allowed us to do was we had made $68 million the year before. It allowed us, with the remaining 6 months of the year, to actually increase our revenues by tapping unused productivity, and we made almost $74 million last year. So what that did was we went from a $3.3 million deficit the year before to a deficit of only $468,000. And that included carrying Edmonton Institution until December 2015, which had costs of almost $400,000. It also included my WFA cost, my workforce adjustment cost, because out of my 500 staff, we did workforce adjust 14 staff. So essentially, we were in the black after those costs are gone, because those were one-off costs. So we're now in a period of expansion, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the other thing that we did was I had 3 very long sessions with ExCom over a period of about 18 months, and I've just been again in the spring to report on our results. Basically, what we talked about with Executive Committee of CSC was the need for an employment continuum. So basically, from intake to WED, where are the critical paths for employment? What should be integrated? How should this flow? And what we quickly talked about, and what an audit had also found, was that employment is sort of scattered throughout CSC. There's no one home for employment. By virtue, there's not even a CD on employment. So we felt it was important to gather up the various pieces of employment and start building a continuum. So a couple of the proposals that I put forward were, in order to do that, was, for one thing, was to gather all of the little pots of money for vocational training that were scattered around the service. There was about 5 different places where money resided. And what I did was I said, if you give me all of the money, I will build a national vocational training plan that will be aligned to labor market needs, and I believe that I can save about $1 million, and I can reintroduce our soft skills program, which had gone unfunded by both CORCAN and CSC for the last, I believe, about 4 years. So CSC agreed to that, and we have done precisely that. So we have created a national vocational training plan, which is linked to labor market trends. We have, out of that plan, set aside about $250,000 for construction. As it's one of the business lines, and I was really pleased to hear Lynn talk about the opportunity that certification in the trades provides our offenders when they get released in terms of getting good jobs. So what we have done is we do basically, I refer to it as pop-up construction. And we do it in a variety of ways. I work together with CSC to get agreement to have an MOU where we would jointly look at all of the construction that CSC does throughout its properties. And I'm very pleased to say that we signed that MOU in the spring. We've worked hard with a third partner who you would know as Public Works and Government Services, even now, though they're now called PSPC. And we have agreement from everybody that CORCAN can act as a general contractor and do jobs which are Serial 4 jobs, which essentially means they're jobs over $1 million. So currently, right now, we will be starting this year on a roofing job at Drummondville, which is about $3 million. We will be building the multi-purpose building, ironically for its end user, CORCAN, in Collins Bay, which is about $6 million. We will be doing the repointing of the brick at Bowdoin Institution, which is around $4 million. And we are in discussions about possibly building a special purpose building at William Head. So the model that we are trying to bring to life is that what we want to do for our offenders is to put as many things around them as possible. So when we do a build, what we do, and I'll take the job at Bowdoin because it's fairly straightforward. It's repointing. So what we are doing with that is that first and foremost, we are going to be giving the offenders who have been selected the soft skills training. That is a real deficit in a lot of our offenders. We hear about this from employers, and I'm sure that Lynn, could probably point, as I think she did actually, in terms of the attitudes and for lack of a better word, maybe the work ethic, how it's impacted if those soft skills are not strong. The second thing that we are going to be doing with them is that they will be given masonry training. So when I provide vocational training, we do it with a community college or a certified body because we always want our offenders to have the certificates from a recognized college. We also provide all of the health and safety training, which is really, really important, not just for the job, but a lot of times when our offenders are going out on release, this is something that if they have their training, it's just worth gold to an employer because they don't have to train them. And then, of course, that is all capped off by the on-the-job training. So they're putting into practice what they have been trained to do, and we give them that opportunity. In terms of the back end of our continuum, and really, quite frankly, the most important part, I believe, of our continuum is where the rubber hits the road, and that's when we're seeing our guys go out onto the street. We only have right now 3 community industries. So basically, as we heard from Lynn, it's really important, and I've always believed this, and I'm always glad when research validates what I say, but it's always very, very important for guys to go out and get a job quickly. Now, you know, we probably have about 3 different types of individuals that we work with. Ones that are, employment is an asset. They're job ready. They don't need any help from us. You know, they've had other issues, but, you know, they've got good employment records and they can go out and get a job. Then I would say the vast majority of the people that we deal with, they need some help. So the community industries is a really good opportunity for offenders to come out on release and work with us and, you know, earn a paycheck, start making money right away, but it also allows them to say, I've got experience outside on the street and start looking for jobs while they have an income to help them make it through. We are looking and exploring the opportunities in our expansion plans to create more community industries around the country, because I do believe that this is a gap that we have. And I should say, I think I forgot to say, I'm so sorry, we actually also have been given back all of the community employment counselors. So the community employment counselors are throughout the country. There are 17 positions, and they are there to help link up federal offenders with employers. So in a nutshell, because I think probably I won't say too much more, but in a nutshell, I guess what I'll say is that it's really important to look at the employment continuum and think about how much we can do inside, but more importantly, how can we prepare for a smooth transition to the community. We do pre-release planning for everything else in corrections except for employment. And to me, that is, as I said earlier, it is the biggest gap. The second thing I'll say is that in the area of Aboriginals, men and women, on the male side, I think we're probably reaching more and doing better with them, although we've got to get more opportunities. On the women, we are still struggling, quite frankly, and I think we have to get a little bit more diverse in terms of our offerings to the women offenders. We are in talks with different organizations to see, what are the interests, where are these women actually getting jobs. When I first came in, there was a very strong bent that it should be all non-traditional trades, but the fact of the matter is that not all women want non-traditional trades. And there is a significant portion of women that we deal with who, may not be able to work full-time due to a variety of reasons. So we're looking more at creating how can we help women find jobs where they can do it part-time, that they're portable, maybe they can start small businesses. So we're trying to really look across the spectrum and see what more offerings we could have. And my very last comment will be that I'm really pleased that the CACs are taking on employment as one of the priorities. I think that, it's really, really important that you're involved because you are the ones who have contacts in the community. You know employers. And I think that there's a lot of room for partnership between CORCAN and CAC members. And now I'm very pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome. Oh, I should say I do have a three-year business plan, which, Lori, I will share with you, and then you can share it with your members.
Absolutely, that's great. And I'm going to reiterate what you talked about, the employment continuum.
Yeah.
That our CAC subcommittee on women offenders met recently, and we discussed what it looks like employment for women, and we too looked along the continuum, pre-employment, employment opportunities in the community, and what we can do at a systems level. How do we make sure that there's readiness within policy and programming, et cetera. And so it was interesting. One of the pre-employment, not surprisingly, was about attitudes toward employment, interview-related skills, and even being able to have the appropriate clothing to feel confident in going into an interview. So there's opportunities, and our CAC subcommittee on women offenders is going to be doing some work around clothing drives and the collection of items like purses or file folders, things that we take for granted perhaps, that make a meaningful impression when you're trying to present yourself in an employment setting. So really interesting. I really like that whole notion of the continuum for us to think about.
Oh, that's great, and I think that's fabulous.
Mm-hmm. Other comments and questions from our group?
This is Gordon Stead, Edmonton Max. Are the farms going to be reinstated or not?
That's way above my pay grade. It's certainly, there's been consultation. I'm sitting here looking at David. He could probably give you a much better answer than me. It's being studied by CSC at this point.
I can maybe say that we're at the point now where we're just finishing off the research documents that were produced, and we anticipate during the month of October that they will be posted. That was our first sort of, milestone after the consultation events are being held. There will be some significant study now that we will take a look at what feasible options we can look at, and they will be presented to the government, who will be making some further decisions about that. So there's a process. I don't think that anybody's saying that a farm, and it all depends what we mean by farms, will be reopened. It's a really big question, and like I say, it's going to take a fair amount of study, and a lot of things have changed since the farms were in place. So they're having to take a very careful and close look. And that being said, there's sure a lot of interest in it and support in the community.
That's good. I guess my view is it's something towards the large animal husbandry stuff that and its therapeutic value. So, anyways, thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Anybody else have comments or questions? Well, hearing none. I know
it's Lynn again. While Lynn was speaking, I did look up the numbers on the proportion of Aboriginal offenders who were in CORCAN in our study, and it was 17%. So that's pretty well aligned with the proportion of Aboriginal offenders incarcerated.
Okay.
I think it was 18% at that time.
Thank you for looking at that so quickly. Well, I know it's been a lot of information that we've covered today, but I think it gives us a very rich context for some of our action planning now. Already we've identified several opportunities have jumped out in terms of pre-release planning, making connections in our community, identifying employers. We even have some of our CAC members who are small business owners who have experiences that they can share with other employers about how to manage and integrate offenders into a workplace. So there's lots of opportunities for us. So thank you, Lynn. It's been wonderful to have you with us. We really appreciate your willingness to do this, not only with us now in English, but there will be a follow-up session starting at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Jean-Francois from Quebec has agreed to facilitate that because my French is pretty rusty and I'm afraid I wouldn't manage very well for that one. So thank you for that. Thanks to David and Donna and Eric at National Headquarters because they've organized this call for us and made all the logistical arrangements. And thanks to all of you. I think this is our first time that we've actually accomplished a coast-to-coast where we've had representation from every single region on this call. I think it speaks well to our enthusiasm to make sure that CAC makes a difference in this employment area. So thank you all very, very much. And if you're interested in participating in the French call, that one will be happening in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, folks. Well,
thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.